Have you ever played a video game and started thinking that it was really similar to a movie you watched? Maybe even a movie you've seen over and over again, maybe even 1,000 times. As you kept playing, little things like plot points, locations, the way characters look or act, and even the physical items in the story's environment started to add up as dead ringers for things in another franchise. Well, while I was playing through Phantasy Star for the first time recently, I was really surprised when I started to notice that a lot of things about the game were oddly familiar to Star Wars. I'm really excited to share what I found with all of you, so without further ado, here's why I think that Phantasy Star is Star Wars. The story of Phantasy Star follows the life of Alice Landale after the murder of her brother Nero. Nero was a member of a rebellion movement to end the malevolent reign of Lassic, who serves as the main antagonist of the story. This loosely sounds like the overarching plot of Star Wars, or really any story that emulates the traditional hero's journey. Even though both Phantasy Star and Star Wars seem to fit this mold well, there are some distinct parallels in the plot, characters, and locations between the two works that just can't possibly be coincidental. The lore of Phantasy Star stems from the corruption of Lassic, a once democratic leader who was revered by the people of the Algol star system. The backstory states that priests from another galaxy that were followers of a new religion had made promises of immortality to those that would join their ranks. Lassic unfortunately fell victim to the temptation of eternal life, and in turn became evil and corrupt. In Star Wars, the Force and its use by both the Sith and the Jedi is regarded as a religious practice, and its perversion is a prevalent theme in both Phantasy Star and Star Wars. The Dark Priests in this story bear considerable resemblance to the Sith, who are a group of evil Force users bent on obtaining power and absolute rule through any means. The concept of looking to achieve immortality and recruiting others to join that quest runs parallel to the story of Darth Plagueis and Darth Sidious. Plagueis was known to have had the power to help keep those he loved from dying, and eventually recruited Chief Palpatine, who later became Darth Sidious, to the dark side as an apprentice. Though Sidious eventually rose to ultimate power in the Star Wars films, Lassic remained a pawn of his own higher power, the literal embodiment of darkness itself, Dark Falls. The themes of immortality and corruption can be even further extended to the origin story of Darth Vader, in which Anakin Skywalker was tempted by Darth Sidious with a promise to be able to prevent Padme, the love of his life, from dying. The Dark Priests in the story also presented Lassic with a very threatening suit of armor. The suit did not only serve as a physical layer of protection, but also came to symbolize Lassic's ruthless and really maniacal rule over the people of the Algol star system. Donning the suit was somehow an impetus to launch Lassic into his descent to evil. Similarly, in the original Star Wars trilogy, the intimidating look of Darth Vader's suit is really meant to strike fear and compliance into his enemies and his comrades. The suits of both characters are used kind of as a device to illustrate their separation from their own humanity, and really a literal barrier between themselves and the people around them. Another coincidental aspect of the lores has to do with the establishment of a rebellion under a tyrant's rule. In the Star Wars movies, Darth Vader is fighting for control for power against a rebellion of the people, and this idea is actually duplicated in Phantasy Star in Lassic's regime. In fact, the entire plot of the game is set into motion when Nero, who's a proponent of the rebellion, is viciously murdered for being a part of that uprising against Lassic to restore peace. As he lays dying, Nero empowers his younger sister Alice to take up his cause, and that's how the story of Phantasy Star begins. Similar motivations for Luke's actions to join the rebellion can be observed if you look at the events of A New Hope. Luke loses his aunt and uncle, and with nowhere else to go, sets off on his own journey with the help of Obi-Wan Kenobi. Following Obi-Wan's death, he passes the torch on to Luke as Nero did to Alice. Phantasy Star takes place in the Algol star system, which is located deep within the Andromeda Galaxy. The Andromeda Galaxy is actually the closest galaxy to our Milky Way and can be observed from Earth on a clear night. Star Wars takes place in a galaxy far, far away, and though it's never really definitively stated to be in the same universe as ours, it's entirely possible that Phantasy Star and the Star Wars universes are one and the same. To further support this idea, The science fiction and fantasy settings in Phantasy Star are reminiscent of many of the main locations in the Star Wars movies from the original trilogy. The Algol star system in Phantasy Star really consists of 3 major planets that you visit throughout the game. There's Motavia, a desert planet that's similar to Tatooine in A New Hope, Dezoris, an ice planet that's similar to Hoth in The Empire Strikes Back, and Palma, a really luscious, tree-filled planet that's similar to Endor in The Return of the Jedi. Not only are the planetary climates and features similar, but other characteristics of their landscapes are strikingly familiar between both adventures. For example, the housing in towns on Palma, Motavia, and Dezoris is a definite throwback to the home of Luke's aunt and uncle, and even a lot of the buildings in Mos Eisley on Tatooine. The dome-shaped buildings in both universes can serve as both residential and business locations. Other similarities lie specifically with the desert planets of Motavia and Tatooine. Motavia's sandy landscape is dotted with antlion pits, and these are nearly identical in appearance to the pit of Carkoon on Tatooine, which houses the infamous Sarlacc beast. In Phantasy Star, wandering into an antlion pit will trigger a battle with a giant spider-like enemy called an antlion, so Alice and crew eventually acquire a vehicle called the Land Rover to help avoid the pits and to move faster throughout the sand, while reducing enemy encounter rates. The vehicle is essentially the same as Luke's land speeder that he uses to hasten his travels through the sands of Tatooine. On the topic of vehicles, both the Phantasy Star and Star Wars universes have a means of interplanetary space travel. In Phantasy Star, mining efforts to recover minerals from the desert planet Motavia's surface is what initially started up space travel in the Algol system, and eventually fueled the expansion of human colonies from Palma to other planets. Interestingly, it's also an established fact in the Star Wars universe that parts of Tatooine were once involved in a mining boom. Space travel in general becomes pivotal to both plots of both stories. Although in the beginning of Phantasy Star, Alice is really restricted to traveling between planets using a robot cop monitored spaceport, she and her party eventually gain access to a spaceship called the Levino, with which they can travel independently of any government monitored facility. The Millennium Falcon is really the Star Wars equivalent to the Levino, granting Luke and his party free movement throughout the galaxy. Many non-playable characters and enemies in Phantasy Star are easily relatable to those in the Star Wars universe. Robot cops are stationed in Palma to enforce the state of martial law under Lassic, and their physical appearances, with their distinctive helmets and full body armor, are very close to those of stormtroopers. The helmet specifically is really reminiscent of that of the bounty hunter Boba Fett. Another set of enemies in Phantasy Star that live on the desert planet Motavia, called N-Farmers, E-Farmers, and Barbarians, bear a really striking physical resemblance to Jawas. Jawas are a native group of junkers that dwell in the deserts of Tatooine. Like the Jawas, Phantasy Star's equivalent desert folks speak in a different language from the main party's English. In A New Hope, Luke can clearly understand the Jawas while he's trading with them, and the farmers and barbarians of Phantasy Star seem surprised when Alice is also able to understand their language. Alice's ability to converse with other creatures is a learned quality as she levels up in the game, and the only other character that has a similar ability is Noah. Noah really strongly parallels many aspects of Princess Leia, who's also conveniently another Jedi, but I'll talk more about that later. Interestingly, there is an emphasis on robot sentience in Phantasy Star that's also seen in the Star Wars movies. Star Wars has a tremendous number of both robots and droids that are doing all sorts of tasks, from scouting and reporting to helping pilot ships. In Phantasy Star, Robot Cop and Androcop enemies have a more limited role of patrolling passageways between different areas, but they still seem to function independently and do seem to be able to take orders. The most definitive example of parity in robot counterparts between Phantasy Star and Star Wars definitely lies between Hapsby and R2-D2. Hapsby is a robot that Alice and crew rescue from a pile of junk that later becomes the pilot of their spaceship. The physical traits of Hapsby, literally from his blue and white coloration to his motility tracks, are nearly an identical replica of the characteristics of R2-D2. Some of the most notable parallels between Phantasy Star and Star Wars can be seen in the game's main characters. The four protagonists in Star Wars, being Luke, Leia, Han, and Chewbacca, are nearly identical to the group of individuals that make up the main party in Phantasy Star, those being Alice, Noah, Odin, and Meow. For starters, there are 3 male characters and a female character in both cases, and both groups contain a non-human member. We've already established that Alice and Luke play the same role in both stories, but Odin, a warrior type with too much bravado that's always seeming to get himself into trouble, can really be strongly correlated to the traits of Han Solo. They're so similar, in fact, that Odin even gets turned to stone, requiring the aid of Alice and his animal companion Meow to rescue him. This really replicates Han Solo's rescue from Jabba's palace after he gets encased in carbonite. Even Noah, who's described as an Esper wizard with close ties to members of his planet's government, has many similarities to Princess Leia. Leia is herself a high-ranking government official, and eventually gains access to her Force abilities, such as telepathy, later on in the original Star Wars trilogy. Conveniently, one of Noah's most important spells is also telepathy. The likenesses between the main characters of both stories don't even end there. The form of combat that each character undertakes in battle in Phantasy Star strongly mirrors their counterparts in Star Wars. Odin and Han use laser guns, while Meow and Chewbacca are both highly effective in hand-to-hand combat. The most blatant likeness is Alice's use of a lightsaber weapon. The lightsaber can be bought and is one of the strongest weapons that she can use in the game. Even though it might feel like a little bit of a stretch to conclude that Alice Landale is some sort of future relative of the Jedis that we know and love from Star Wars, there's still a lot of interesting crossovers between the two stories. The timing of Phantasy Star's Japanese release in 1987 came only a few years after the release of the original Star Wars trilogy. It's really clear that the game's developers drew inspiration from the movies. In fact, Yuji Naka, one of the game's lead developers, stated in an interview that Phantasy Star was heavily inspired by Star Wars. Obviously, some of the comparisons that I've presented here are drawn from the prequels, which didn't exist at the time of Phantasy Star's release, but for the sake of a thorough comparison, I've included them here. Phantasy Star was one of the first science fiction fantasy games in the role-playing game genre. For game developers that were trying to make an impression and to unfold a really unique and compelling narrative on yet another take of the hero's journey, what better to model after than one of the most popular and influential space operas of all time?